He was dancing. He was gasping for breath. But the applause continued, becoming louder.
Танцуй, Никита.
His heart was in his mouth. The future leader of the powerful nation, Nikita Khrushchev, performed his play. He was dancing hopak at Comrade Stalin's command. Having lost his strength, he sat down on a chair and felt something soft and wet burst under him. Beria had placed a tomato under him. The audience burst out laughing. A few years later, everyone was dead. The lucky ones died of natural causes. Some were executed. This funny and absurd little man, Stalin's misunderstood court jester, Nikita Khrushchev, took care of it. For 20 years, the Kremlin's fool concealed himself behind the fool's mask. He fawned and abased himself, all for the one cause: to survive, to come to the superpower, and at last to take vengeance on his bitter enemy, Stalin. The personal tragedy of the funniest General Secretary of the USSR. What led to Nikita Khrushchev's murderous deeds? And what was the sin against the Kremlin's fool, for which Stalin had to pay with his life? (1921) Donetsk. He is happy. He is racing to get home to see his wife and embrace his children. They haven't seen each other for 3 years. Throughout this time, at the front of the Civil War, he thought about them. Dear Frosya is a treasure, the only woman who could properly understand, protect, and give him support. And she gave him the most precious gift of all: faith in himself that Khrushchev had needed since he was a child. 1902, village of Kalinovka. That day, Nikita failed to get to school. The classmates formed a circle around him. They were pulling his clothes and laughing. They repeated this bullying almost every day. The boy's family was starving, which is why he had to go to school in cast-offs. He was ashamed and tried to keep away from the other children. But his silence only excited the young bullies. Nikita kept silent, lowering his eyes, but the classmates still mocked him. He didn't see the faces of his torturers, didn't hear them laugh. All he wanted was for it to stop. He slowly raised his head. The laughing stopped. Nikita waved his hands and sang out at the top of his voice. There was such resoluteness in his movements and voice that the classmates were mesmerized. When he stopped singing, they cheered, "Artist!"
Artist!
He was dumbfounded. It turned out that the best way to deflect their bullying was to act the fool. For years, though, he remembered the bitter taste of humiliation and became more unsociable and unapproachable until he met Frosya. She was sincere and trustful, and without malice. Under her influence, Nikita's damaged soul gradually melted. They were in love and were soon married. Frosya supported everything he did. and Nikita tried hard to make his beloved wife proud of him. He got a job in the plant and worked hard. He even joined the Bolsheviks party. But he sidelined party affairs and a social life in favor of a cozy home life. He looked into Khrushchev's loving eyes and at his cheerful children and felt so happy. Soon, he would embrace them all. He kicked at the door with all his strength. Gloomy and foreign faces, a silence that could kill, a coffin, strangers, his children in tears. No, it's impossible. He threw himself on the coffin. He embraced the cold body and burst into tears. Khrushchev, why? He didn't notice his scared children trying desperately to snuggle up to him. He didn't hear the neighbors telling him about the terrible typhoid epidemic that claimed thousands of lives, including his Khrushchev. There was only one thing on his mind: how to live without her. He felt defeated and depressed. His dreams and his plans for the future no longer mattered, as he had lost the most important person in the world.
Не найдя жены в живых, он испытал не просто глубочайшее разочарование, глубочайший надлом. Он потерял единственную семью. Если бы жена осталась бы жива, Хрущев никогда не сделал бы не то, что государственной карьеры. Он никогда не был бы даже секретарем райкома, по сути. Ну, потому что он получил бы сразу, вот, знаете, такую свою крестьянскую мечту и остался бы в своей крестьянской эманации, в крестьянской сути.
After his wife's death, he couldn't stay in their house. He took the children and moved to a small apartment. He broke all communications with the outside. It seemed that nothing could bring him back to life. Until one day, there was a knock at his door. The young party instructor, Nikita Khrushchev, decided to inquire why the comrade Khrushchev had been ignoring party meetings for the last year. Is this proper behavior for a Bolshevik? Nina was surprised by his droopy shoulders, pale face and piercing eyes. He had the look of a wounded animal. Nina heard about the tragedy that had happened in the Khrushchev's home 1 year earlier. But she couldn't believe that Nikita had taken the loss so badly. After that, she visited him often, looking after him and his children. Nikita Khrushchev became Khrushchev's trusty helpmate for the rest of his life. Although they weren't married, they lived together in a common law marriage for over 50 years. He never loved her, but treated her with respect and gratitude. She took care of the housekeeping and his children, and inspired Khrushchev to make a career in the party. He was rarely at home and devoted less attention to his children. He even tried to avoid them. The children bore a strong resemblance to Khrushchev. He grieved for them. It took time for the wounds of loss to heal. The children needed their father's attention, but Nikita tried not to think about it. Meanwhile, his elder son, Leonya, was terribly jealous of his stepmother. He infuriated Nina with his behavior, trying to attract his father's attention. Some years later, Khrushchev felt incredibly sorry that he had ignored his son.
Отказавшись во многом от теплого отцовского отношения с сыном Леонидом, Хрущев постоянно пытался найти себе других сыновей. Он был очень склонен к фаворитизму. Он постоянно пытался найти себе молодых подвижников, где бы он бы ни работал. Вся его история – это поиск семьи, поиск смысла, поиск сына и постоянное разочарование. А если Хрущев не мог найти себе вот опору в ком-то конкретном, он находил ее себе в массовом таком, в массовой семье.
1928, Yuzovka. He just breezed in. His wild eyes swept past a surprised Nina, who had met him on the threshold. Without saying a word, he ran to the kitchen and drank half a bottle of vodka. He poured the remains over his face and down his clothes. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Young men in mufti were looking for Nikita Khrushchev. Nina had no time to say anything before her husband burst into the living room. He was too weak to stand and was laughing and hiccuping loudly. Seeing the strangers, Khrushchev brightened up even more. He offered them drinks and then started an indecent chastushka with a stupid voice. Nina snapped her fingers. She had never seen Nikita so drunk before. The strangers had a laugh and left. When the door closed behind them, Khrushchev sighed with relief and fell on the sofa, drained of all his strength. It was the end of the 20th year. Lenin's former comrades created a tough opposition to the power of the newly made General Secretary Stalin. And under the leader's order, the security service employees started to look for enemies in the party. The actual Donetsk didn't escape the purges, at that time the town of Yuzovka. In 1928, at a meeting of the local party activists, all the participants were arrested on suspicion of conspiracy against Stalin. It's quite possible that Khrushchev knew something. Maybe somebody told him about the plans of the security service, but he didn't attend that meeting and had put on the drunken act at home. This funny undertaking saved Khrushchev's life. He was so convincing as a drunken fool that the young men in mufti didn't suspect anything. Khrushchev played the fool again, convinced that he'd found a great disguise. The more he played the fool, the more he moved up the party ladder, edging ever closer to Stalin. But then the time came when he had to wear this fool's mask as his true face. It became his curse. 1930, Moscow. They studied together at Moscow Industrial Academy. Nikita, attentive and polite, saw Nadezhda home again and again. He always tried to be beside this modest and silent girl because he knew that she was the wife of the comrade Stalin. Khrushchev didn't give anything away, but he took the opportunity to praise the leader's party policy before Nadezhda. Above all, this modest party organizer wanted to be observed, and if he was lucky, he wanted to be signed. His heart leapt. This was it. After having some doubts, he expressed thanks to them for his invitation. The Kremlin's corridors were safeguarded. Nadezhda opened the door with her own key.
Tatka, это ты?
Tatka. This was the name Stalin gave to his wife when they were at home. He heard about a prospective party member, Khrushchev, from Nadezhda, and also from his faithful assistant Kaganovich. It was the beginning of the 30th year. The old party members, Leninists, headed by Trotsky, created a tough opposition, and the position of the General Secretary became increasingly precarious. He needed devoted people, and Stalin gave heed to Khrushchev. Stalin laughed and made fun at the table. While pouring wine, he entertained with the finest Georgian dishes. The emotionally strained Khrushchev felt weak.
Ну, Никитка, попробуй наше ситцеви.
Так это курица. А у нас в Юзанке вот курицу не готовят. У нас петуха, значит, берут к нему лучка, как говорится, режут петуха, это, значит, лука там, перчика, вот, перчика всякого, чесночка. Ну, то есть, супер.
Khrushchev swapped recipes. Stalin kept a close watch on his guests.
Khrushchev был, на этот случай, первый, это послушный исполнитель, абсолютно надежный послушный исполнитель. И, во-вторых, Сталину импонировала та народность и тот, я бы сказал, та непосредственность, с которой Хрущев общался с массами. То есть как руководитель, при всей своей и невысокой образованности, и, может быть, недостаточно широком кругозоре, Хрущев вместе с тем воплощал в себе, ну, я бы сказал, такие лучшие черты народного характера. Не лез за словом в карман, всегда умел отшутиться, всегда умел как-то ярко и образно подать, порой достаточно сложные там какие-то партийные построения.
After the first meeting with Stalin, Khrushchev quickly advanced up the ladder, soon becoming the leader of the district committee of party. Over the years, he went on to become the head of the whole party organization in Moscow. It was a meteoric rise. But the higher he rose, the higher the price of his success. He called on his assistant and close friend, Boris Treacherous. The room was a mess, papers and letters thrown about, and three men were examining a document.
О, товарищ Хрущев. Отлично. Подпишите, пожалуйста. Вот здесь.
He pretended to examine the document. Treacherous looked at him appealingly. The enemy of the people. Should he sign it? Khrushchev knew Treacherous respected him. What sort of an enemy was he? What if he didn't sign it? They would be accomplices. Khrushchev was terrified. He closed his eyes and signed the document.
Сталин подбирал людей, где было за что зацепиться в биографии, понимая, что манипулировать ими легче. И уж они-то будут работать не на страх, а, так сказать, ну, и за страх, и за совесть.
Khrushchev was walking down the prison corridor. He was the secretary of the district committee and was in charge of personally inspecting the actions of the investigatory powers. Somebody called him. He looked closely at the heavily bearded prisoner. It was Boris Treacherous. Khrushchev was terrified and quickened his step. Shouts rang out behind him. Khrushchev felt sick. What was he guilty of? Why must he bear such humiliations? There was only one thing to do: forget about it. As time passed, he grew accustomed to signing the lists of the victims of political repression without hesitation. And he consoled himself again and again. Soon, all the enemies would be exterminated, and all his troubles would soon be over. He decided not to risk his position. Because the higher party gave him benefits he could never have dreamed of. But he felt guilty being part of the high-ranking apartment. This is the famous house on the riverfront. Right here, the Khrushchevs settled down in a 4-room apartment. It's a real Soviet paradise. It had an oak parquet floor, marble bathrooms, and ceilings painted by artists from the Hermitage Museum. It also had a clinic, a cinema, and a kindergarten. The inhabitants ate in the dining hall free of charge. They could pay with special coupons. If there was communism in the Soviet Union, it existed here. Khrushchev thought that his life was in good shape. The housekeeping and the children were in Nina's safe hands. He was in a good professional standing with excellent prospects. So the criminal case that landed on his table, addressed to Nikita Khrushchev, came out of the blue. A band of robbers were arrested. And this band includes Leonid Khrushchev, his son. His blood ran cold. They could report this to Stalin, and it would be the end of his career. Khrushchev decided to confess and promise his deep devotion to the leader. He entered Stalin's office. The leader looked at him. Nikita Khrushchev understood that the case was already reported to him. He didn't know what to say. The silence was deafening. And suddenly, Stalin, by accident or not, dropped his papers. Nikita blushed. His head was ringing. He threw himself at the leader's legs, picked up the papers, and handed them over. Stalin looked at him. Nikita felt that the tension in the office was lifted. The master had forgiven him. Nothing threatens Nikita. Leaving the office, he looked in the mirror and saw the fool's smiling face with spaniel eyes. He didn't even think of his son. Nikita Khrushchev will never forget that visit to the leader. Feelings of weakness rose again. He will always be afraid of Stalin and hate him for that fear. For that nasty tinge of humiliation and necessity to always play the fool. If only he could survive and not lose what he already had. He failed to close his son's case. But the hearings were held behind closed doors. The members of the band received the ultimate penalty: execution. Leonid was involved in this case as a witness. But Stalin decided that Khrushchev should not be allowed to get away with this. In a few months, Khrushchev got the position of the first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine. Anyone would consider this a real gift. But Nikita Khrushchev understood that he was exiled from the Kremlin. It was a bad omen. When leaving for Kiev, Khrushchev was determined to win back Stalin's favor at any cost. And with this in mind, he flooded the Ukraine with blood. For the next 11 years, he remained in the Ukraine. There, Khrushchev learned to dance with his famous hopak, to sing the Ukrainian folk songs in a terrible mixed Russian-Ukrainian dialect, and to kill millions of people. Being away from Moscow, he showed his true nature, and that terrified the whole country. After Khrushchev's arrival in Kiev, the following encoded text was sent to the Politburo of the Central Committee in Moscow. Dear Losif Vissarionovich, Every month, the Ukraine suffers from 17 to 18,000 victims of the political repression. But Moscow insists that it shouldn't be more than 2,000 or 3,000. I ask you to take measures. And the measures were taken. Khrushchev was authorized to shoot more. The party meeting had been going on for 4 hours. The deputy chairman of the Vinnytsia District Executive Committee, Kozis, while sitting in the hall, felt that he could hardly keep his eyes open because of the monotonous speech. He tried to stay awake, but couldn't.
Враги хотели убить нашего родного товарища Сталина.
On hearing Comrade Stalin's name, the sleepy Kozis jumped up and began to clap loudly.
Я не хотел, товарищи, я не хотел.
The agents of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, NKVD, were behind him. They took away the spy and the enemy of the people. Khrushchev was informed about the incident. He ordered to find Kozis's secret accomplices, those who had worked or had dealt with him on personal or public matters, and to exterminate the hedge enemies, such as Kozis. 35,000 people were subjected to repression in Vinnytsia alone in 1938. Stalin was satisfied. In 1941, at the beginning of the war, he appointed Khrushchev as a member of the War Council as a sign of gratitude. Khrushchev couldn't believe it. Nikita Khrushchev was triumphant. But he didn't know what would later happen to him that would threaten not only his career, but also his life. (1943), Kuibyshev. The soldiers filled the hospital yard. Who were the most accurate shooters, aviators or sailors? They emptied a bottle of vodka. A sailor put the bottle on his head. A pilot took aim and shot. The sailor silently fell to the ground. Blood ran down his forehead. Leonid sobered up in a flash. One word ran through his head: tribunal. The news struck Khrushchev. His son Leonia must be executed, but he is so young. He hadn't done anything for his son. No warm words, nor any parental care. Tears choked Nikita Khrushchev. He had betrayed Frossia and didn't protect their son. But he can save him. He marched into the leader's office to explain. He looked at Stalin's eyes and realized that there was no hope. But Khrushchev knew what he had to do. He dropped down on his knees with a beatific smile and bitter tears and began to creep up to Stalin. The leader looked daggers at him.
Прости.
Товарищ Хрущев, идите воюйте.
He could barely stand. He was engulfed by a peculiar feeling of emptiness, just like something had burst inside him. Stalin apologized. Nothing else mattered. The most essential thing is that he managed to save Leonia. Now he could go to the front and come back a hero. And when the war is over, they will meet and he will make amends. Leonia will apologize to him. Stricken by grief, he sat in a shelter next to Major Zamorin, his son's comrade. Khrushchev couldn't believe what he was hearing. Leonia didn't return from the last flight operation. Nothing could be mended now. There is nobody to whom he could say the sincere parental words that he was holding back all these years. Leonid Khrushchev died a hero's death. Khrushchev couldn't even cry. There was a stabbing pain in his temples, and he couldn't breathe. A terrible thought flitted across his mind. Leonia was punished for the father's sins, for the shooting of innocent people, for arresting innocent families, and for making children orphans. And for what? Why did he kowtow to Stalin? To survive in the repression hell. But now he, Nikita, is still alive, and Leonia is dead. His son is dead, but Stalin is alive. He was determined to exterminate Stalin. While wearing the fool's mask, he will study the enemy's habits and wait for a suitable moment and strike. 1953. The Stalin's traditional dinner is in full swing. Last time, the gatherings were held every day, or more exactly, every night. They gathered at 11 in the evening and left just before dawn. They were all extremely tired with this regime. But Stalin, who was suffering from insomnia, wouldn't let his retinue go. Beria played the usual role of a toastmaster and forced the guests to eat and drink. Stalin himself didn't touch the food. He was suspicious of being poisoned. He saw enemies everywhere.
Ну что, товарищи, расстреляем Никиту или пусть танцует?
He danced. Everyone laughed at his clumsiness and didn't suspect what he was thinking of. He knew the time was close. He had to keep calm and kill Stalin.
Танцуй, Никита.
Best of all, by Beria's hands. I must consider everything carefully. I must remove Beria. Malenkov and Molotov don't have to be killed. It is enough to deprive them of their high office. He performed his last move, stepped forward and bowed. It began with the physician's case. Stalin received a denunciation. The Leningrad physician, Lydia Timashuk, informed him that the group of court physicians is about to revolt. Their aim is to poison the devoted members of the Politburo and Comrade Stalin. The next day, the Soviet Special Services declared a hunt for miscreants wearing a white uniform. Khrushchev understood it was time. He convinced the suspicious Beria that Stalin must sign the order of his arrest. That would do the job. Then he could move aside and observe. Khrushchev saw Beria removing Stalin's entourage, and he replaced them with his devoted people. Firstly, the physicians, then the household servants, and lastly, the leader himself. He had prepared for him a terrible death, using a virulent poison made in the secret laboratory of NKVD.
Это не просто отравление. Отравление было, как говорится, по всем направлениям. Кровоизлияние было настолько страшным, что когда вскрыли желудок Сталина, то все было как будто посечено дробью. Как будто вот взяли в желудок внутри и выстрелили из дробовика. Все, вот такие кровяные пятнышки, такие кровоизлияния. Все, желудок весь кровоизлияние, все, весь кишечник в кровоизлияниях. Все полностью, все, весь организм стал пропускать кровь.
Stalin's funeral was immortalized in this unique 1953 film footage. This is Lavrenti Beria. He is the first among the people carrying the leader's coffin. Nikita Khrushchev is just behind. He saw how confidently Lavrenti Pavlovich behaved, how he made the orders. Beria was sure that he was the successor, being unaware that the worst was still to come, and the full Khrushchev would strike the last blow. Beria didn't know that at the time Khrushchev had gathered his friends, Generals Zhukov-Batitsky and Moskalenko, under the veil of military maneuvers. He rounded up support from Malenkov, Molotov, Kaganovich. They burst into Beria's office and arrested him without explanation. The former chief of NKVD was executed at Lubyanka. Khrushchev became leader of the country. He combined the position of the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union with the position of chief of the Council of Ministers, having taken it from Malenkov. After that, he became the absolute authority. He was sure that he had taken vengeance and won a victory. And now, at last, everything would be okay. He hadn't realized that the fool's mask that he was wearing for years had become his true nature. The General Secretary's tragedy was that on his way to leadership, he was not learning how to lead the country, but how to be a fool. The reception on the occasion of the Soviet leader's visit to the United States of America was in full swing. All the American movie stars were there. Marilyn Monroe, Harry Copper, and Frank Sinatra. On the Soviet side, Nikita Khrushchev and his wife Nina Petrovna, and a few ambassadors. The delegation watched the new blockbuster Can-Can. And now Nikita Khrushchev commented in his usual manner about what he had watched. His indignation had no limits. Why did the actresses shamelessly kick their legs and show their underclothes? How could anyone like it? Just look at this. How? In order to make it more convincing, he pulled up his coat and danced something like a can-can. The Americans were shocked. They had never seen something like that before. Once again, he'd become the fool. Till the end, he accused Losif Stalin, on whom he continued to take vengeance even after his death. October 1961, at 6 p.m., the militia blocked Red Square. And as night fell, the searchlights illuminated a plot behind the mausoleum where Stalin would be reburied. The grave was dug at 9 o'clock in the evening. And late into the night, the 8 officers carried Stalin's body out of the mausoleum and buried him near the Kremlin's wall. The next morning, only Lenin's body lay in the mausoleum. Stalin was not there. When, due to the Khrushchev's reformatory activities, the people in the USSR were on the brink of war, the former comrades of the General Secretary removed Khrushchev. Since then, he lived in the camp. His name disappeared from the pages of the great Soviet encyclopedia. 1971, the country celebrated the day of cosmonautics. The modest pensioner Nikita Khrushchev was watching again and again the famous frames. He remembered that day very well.
Вот они, покорители космоса.
Gagarin was advancing along a red carpet to report about the first human spaceflight. But something was missing in the picture. If one looked closely, he could see a little spot next to Gagarin. And it's not a faulty tape. That day, they were advancing side by side. two happy conquerors, the first cosmonaut and the first man of the best country in the world. Later, Khrushchev's picture disappeared even from the film negative. His face was erased in order to erase his name from the national remembrance forever. (1953), Moscow. A car approached a small mansion on Malonikitskaya Street. Out of it appeared Colonel Korotkov and several servicemen. The colonel showed the guards his ID of the USSR Interior Ministry. "Secret documents. I must deliver them personally. Come in." Korotkov and the soldiers entered the cabinet. Before them sat a man in pince nez. He immediately knew why these people had come to him. He rushed to the briefcase and pulled out a gun. At that moment, the military men opened fire. People in the street stopped when they heard shooting in the mansion. In the cabinet, however, it was all over. Soldiers quickly covered the body with canvas and loaded it into the car. So without a trial, the Minister of Internal Affairs, Lavrenti Pavlovich Beria, had been killed. He'd been the most influential person in the country, the main contender to the throne, recently vacated by Stalin. He was killed on the orders of Khrushchev, with the support of Malenkov, Molotov and Kaganovich. They were pushed into murder by an animalistic fear of Beria. They saw in him shades of the late Stalin. A brutal executioner responsible for taking more than 600,000 lives. It was he who in 1937 organized the most atrocious repression in the USSR. He had legalized torture and executed prisoners without trial. Under his rule, the NKVD had become the most powerful institution in the state. He was regarded as all-powerful. He was feared by the entire country, even by Stalin himself. But no one knew that Beria also lived in fear. For him, every day might be his last. And to survive, Beria had to fight, to plot, and to kill. And he was guided not by desire to gain favor or even a lust for power. "We will remove weeds and plow up Georgia." But fear was taken to absurd levels. (1921), Baku. He was looking at the men who'd been taken from the house. He knew what would happen next. Soldiers would put them against the wall. There would be a command to pull the trigger. Young Beria was the last in a row of those who were to shoot. He was looking at the people near the wall, but didn't want to kill any of them. His finger trembled on the trigger. But there was no command. Lavrenti's knees were giving way. He simply couldn't kill a man. A wave of horror swept over his body. Only one question stuck in his head. Why? (1918), Baku. Bloodstained, he was sitting in the cabinet and couldn't understand what was going on. Why were they beating him? What did these people want? Lavrenti Beria, a young architect and excellent student, couldn't answer these questions. Sometime before, he had received a diploma. and along with it, a long-awaited chance to finally get out of poverty. He had been determined to succeed. As a child, Lavrenti painted amazing icons. Beria remembered showing these works to his father. Pavel Beria, amazed at his son's talents, sold half his house in order to send his boy to college. His father's faith paid off. First, Lavrenti graduated from Sukhumi School, then from a prestigious architectural technical school in Baku. He received his first order and was relieved to have a chance to bring his family out of poverty and to thank his father, who had sacrificed so much. In those days, the future seemed happy and carefree. Then one day, two men came up to him in the street. They showed him some paperwork. It was an offer to cooperate with the Bolshevik Party, which was leading a fierce struggle to gain power in the country. Its main opponent was the Musavat Nationalist Party, which proclaimed the idea of Azerbaijan's independence, and which for several years the Bolsheviks tried to unsuccessfully force out. Lavrenti didn't realize that he had been chosen deliberately. Among Beria's friends from the technical school were sympathizers of the Musavat Party. So the guy had to learn who they were. And to do this, he had to become a secret agent. They tried to persuade him, they beat him, but Lavrenti was adamant. And then strangers dragged him to the window. Beria froze in horror. In the yard, he saw his former classmate with his hands tied. Their eyes met for a moment. He was staring at the body of the man he had just shot. He had pulled the trigger. Beria didn't want to kill, but there was no other choice. He became a Chekist. What did it mean? Leather jacket, revolver, and food rations? Yes, but there was more to it than that. Being Chekist was all about surviving, and he was desperate to live. He knew it as he looked through the window at all those innocent people who had been executed. Suddenly, he had been seized by animal fear. Obeying this fear, Beria signed a hidden paper of cooperation, not realizing there would be no turning back.
Он был внедрен в мусаватистскую разведку.
He was filtered into the Muscovat Secret Service. In that part of Transcaucasia, which is now Azerbaijan, the Musavat Republic was formed. In this territory were Turkish forces, and Beria, filtered into their organization, was passing information to the Bolsheviks. Every time he pulled the trigger, he was convinced that it would be the last time. Soon they would let him go. And then it will all work out again. He will forget the nightmarish past. Eventually, due to the efforts of secret agents, the Bolsheviks managed to seize power in Azerbaijan. In 1922, the country joined the USSR. Beria had completed his mission, but no one was going to let him go. 1924, Soviet Georgia. Beria would remember that day for the rest of his life. He, a young Chekist, had the great honor of pouring wine during a party of prominent Bolsheviks in Georgia. The people who gathered around the table had made a revolution in Georgia. They rightly considered themselves its creators. And now they were receiving a guest from Moscow. Everyone considered the guest an upstart who had made his career murdering people. And now he came to bring the order in Georgia. As Beria was pouring the wine, his hand trembled. Beria met the man's eyes. It was Stalin. Beria felt the man's immense power. Stalin raised his glass and made a toast. There is a great deal of weed in Georgia. It is therefore necessary to plow up Georgia. A heavy silence descended over the table. All those Bolsheviks realized that the next day, they too might be called the weed. Beria also understood this. A chill swept over his body. This was his chance. It's now or never. We will remove weed and plow up Georgia. He drank his wine and put the empty glass on the table. Everything went dark. Lavrenti didn't seem to notice Stalin's fixed gaze. He didn't see the strict faces of the masters at the table. The next day, Stalin left, and Beria was appointed deputy head of the Cheka in Georgia. Such a prompt promotion surprised everyone. To the old Bolsheviks in Georgia, Beria was an outsider, an upstart, and they started to hate him. But Beria didn't care. He has gained a powerful patron, almost a soulmate, Comrade Stalin. Lavrenti felt happy. The new appointment revived the old Beria. A quiet, reasonable man who for some time forgot about the former dream for the sake of a new one. To justify the trust placed in him, to take care of his safety, finally to prove himself. Beria enthusiastically took to his work. He tracked down spies and sent them to prison. As an architect, he was implementing his most ambitious project, the building of a new state without blood or senseless murders, unlike neighboring Russia. It was an amazing period in Lavrenti's life. He bought back his father's house and began to earn huge amounts of money. But then came a telegram from Moscow. Comrade Stalin was not pleased with the work of the Georgian Cheka. For Beria, it was a death sentence. He was seized by fear. Lavrenti was in despair. Stalin did not appreciate his efforts. At the same time, Beria's colleagues in Moscow executed several hundred spies and enemies of the Soviet rule a week. The Georgian Cheka didn't show even half of these amounts. Stalin wasn't interested in reasons for this. The General Secretary demanded victims, and Beria gave them to him. (1924) Georgia. He was standing against the wall, terrified, afraid to look into the people's eyes. He didn't need to wait for orders. He now gave the orders. Rumor has it that in Georgia, repressions were even more severe than in other regions of the Soviet Union. Beria was like a mini Stalin. In Moscow, Stalin controls the course of repressions, inflicts resolutions on interrogations and protocols, gives advice on whom to beat and whom to interrogate intensively. Beria does exactly the same in the Transcaucasia. In my opinion, even Baragov, an Azerbaijani, was more reserved, and it was hard for Stalin not to notice this. Beria was fulfilling what he had promised. He became the hands with which Stalin removed Georgian weeds. Fire! He could not get used to this sound. He would wake in the middle of the night, terrified. In his dreams, he saw innocent people being shot without trial. He couldn't sleep. Nightmares were driving Lavrenti crazy. And then one night, stupefied by blood, insomnia and fatigue, Beria decided enough. The head of the Cheka was reading an application. Beria was asking to be allowed to study in the Polytechnic Institute in Baku. He didn't want to be a Chekist. He wanted to live. He had married and wanted to rebuild his life. Lavrenti knew that he might not get out of this room. His young wife waiting outside also knew this. Beria watched his boss with horror. He carefully placed the paper on the table, picked up a pen, and raised his eyes. Lavrenti was rooted to the spot. He won't give up, whatever the cost. The chief was looking at him, long and hard. And then, with a sharp stroke of the pen, put his signature under the application. Lavrenti couldn't believe his eyes. They let him go. Silently, without any conditions. The world had changed. It became brighter and more colorful. He hugged his wife. Finally, there was no need to be afraid. He can realize his dream of becoming an architect and eventually, perhaps, to forget the horrors of the past. He was playing football with the boys in the yard. He was shouting and laughing like a child. Finally, a terrible burden fell from his shoulders. His wife was hanging out the washing and smiling, looking at her husband. Their lives were looking up. At first, he didn't notice the black car coming up to the house. Lavrenti stopped playing with the ball. Beria knew something terrible was going to happen. He realized with horror that these people would never let him go. All his dreams were in vain. There is no turning back. He didn't want his family to see them. The arrival of the black car was a bad sign. Lavrenti hastily kissed his confused wife and sat in the car. He stared out of the window. His world was in retreat, and all because of the hated system. Beria didn't know that in several years he would become the embodiment of this system. A brutal executioner who in 1937 would kill 600,000 people with one stroke of a pen. A bloody monster who would be murdering people with his own hands, without fear or pangs of conscience. And now he was staring out of the car window, saying goodbye to the carefree world of fun and children's dreams, to which he would never return. Later on, Lavrenti learned that the head of Cheka signed only a small vacation permit, and that no one was going to let Beria go. He was simply too valuable. It was the mid-20s. The old Bolsheviks in the Georgian government didn't accept Stalin as leader, and the General Secretary could only establish his authority with reliable and trusted people. Lavrenti Beria found himself on that list. Eventually, Stalin saw in Beria a reliable executioner, a man he could order about like most of his other men, with a reputation that may have been considered tarnished. Take Vyshinsky, hire Menshevik, who wrote out the order for Lenin's arrest. At any time, Stalin could simply crush him by accusing him for writing that order. The same was true for Beria. 1931, Georgia. He was walking through the CC long corridors. The cabinet doors were closed. The telephones wouldn't stop ringing. There was nobody else there. The sound of a phone ringing in the empty building brought him to his new cabinet. The cabinet of the Secretary of the Georgian Communist Party CC. This was a considerable advance, a huge leap in the career of a young Chekist. But was Beria in fact pleased? No, Stalin's man was hated here. That day, in protest against Beria's appointment, no one went to work. Soon, these people would pay dearly for their action. Beria himself would make sure of it. He wasn't the naive, good-natured architect anymore, but Lord's punishing sword, Stalin's right hand. With the leader's consent, Beria ordered the execution of the entire personnel of Georgia's government. So he fulfilled the precept of Stalin. Beria was no longer interested in the moral aspect of his work. However, while shooting and punishing, he was making more enemies. The hunt for the CC secretary's life had begun. There were several attempted murders, but Beria tried to ignore this fact. He forced himself not to be afraid. However, his fear grew. 1934, Lake Ritsa, Abkhazia. Two ordinary families were sitting by the side of a lake. Beria and his friend, the head of Abkhazia, Lakoba, rarely spent their weekend like this. Beria didn't hide his pleasure. He was enjoying these rare, carefree moments. Because of his work, he spent very little time with his family and became increasingly sullen and withdrawn. He couldn't talk to anyone about his worries. Most of all, Beria was afraid that someone would find out about his fear. On that night, Lakoba was tossing and turning, trying to fall asleep. In the distance, he could hear the sound of an engine. Lakoba came out of the tent. The noise stopped. He heard voices. It was a bad sign. Lakoba decided not to wait for what would happen next. He rushed to save his and his friend's family. "Lavrenti, wake up! We must leave!" Beria grabbed his wife and son. Under cover of darkness, they ran into the nearest ravine. Lavrenti didn't understand why they needed to hurry. What's the worst that could happen at night in a deserted area? Beria looked in horror at the place where a moment ago he had been peacefully sleeping with his family. The tent was riddled with bullets. Lavrenti trembled and turned white. He was seized by animal fear. He wanted to hide, to run away from danger. But where could he go? There was no safe place in Georgia. Everybody hated him, from the CC party members to ordinary citizens. But Moscow was another thing. A city where no one knew him, where he could disappear and work quietly, start all over again, and finally forget old fears which were driving him mad. 1934, Tbilisi. Without following someone else's order. He had killed her and felt nothing, neither pity nor fear. Like a heartless monster, he murdered a human being over a book. Here is this book. In 1935, in the USSR, it became a bestseller. Beria's work on the history of the Bolshevik organizations in Transcaucasia became Stalin's reference book. It proved that the General Secretary, who was on a par as Lenin, was the Bolsheviks' leader and father of the revolution. Officially, it was written by Lavrenti Beria, and no one could prove it to the contrary. A host of writers, headed by the Georgian historian Bibinishvili, was shot long before the publication, and the last witness had died in Beria's cabinet. Beria was certain that the publishing of the book would be his ticket to Moscow. The book appeared at a very convenient time. It was a special trump card that Beria could use. Comrade Stalin, look, I wrote about you. Is this all correct? Yes, Comrade Beria. Well done. Indeed, Stalin highly praised the work of his Georgian associate, but the leader wasn't in a hurry to invite him to the capital. The assassination attempts on the Georgian Chekist became more frequent. In despair and guided by the instinct of self-preservation, Beria would make the last and the most terrible sacrifice. 1936, Georgia. The two old friends, Lakoba and Beria, were in the theater. Everything was going well, but during the performance, Lakoba felt unwell and left before the final act. Beria stayed. He was admiring the graceful movements of the dancers. Beria was aware that he would never see his friend again. He knew that at that very moment, Lakoba was writhing around in agony. The man who had saved his life had now been poisoned by Beria's hand. Lakoba had signed his death warrant during his conversation with Stalin, where he had refused to organize new repressions in Georgia. But Beria could not refuse. He knew that heading the bloody slaughter in 1937 in Georgia would not only be his ticket to Moscow, but his only way to stay alive. He wouldn't repeat Lakoba's mistake. What was Beria thinking while driving to Moscow? The fact that he had finally reached the top and become powerful? Or the fact that through his new position, he would bring benefit to the state? No, he was once again thinking of his own survival. Beria knew that the higher up the corporate ladder he climbed, the greater the risk to his life. But he could neither refuse nor disappoint Stalin, who had saved his life. The fact that he had consistently followed the party line showed that he was a devoted son of the Communist Party and therefore would be a reliable candidate for promotion in Moscow. As he had already proven, with blood, what he was capable of. Stalin appreciated this. Beria knew that only the strongest would survive in the Kremlin menagerie. He was staring out of the car window at a huge field where several farmers were fertilizing the earth with ashes. He was afraid that he too would one day turn to ash. Beria could easily manage the scenario. Being taken out of his house at night and forced into a car. Being beaten during interrogations and then shot. A car takes a barrel full of his ashes to this field where they are scattered. Nourishing the collective farm with their ashes was Stalin's way to deal with Lenin's former associates. He could do the same with anyone. Beria was afraid of the post, entrusted to him by Stalin. None of the previous NKVD chairmen had survived. The organization was previously led by Yagoda. Nikolai Yezhov executed Yagoda along with all of his men. Now, Beria was to clear the NKVD of Yezhov and his men. But Beria couldn't refuse. His gratitude to Stalin for his liberation from Georgia was stronger than the fear of being killed. Beria eagerly set to work, surpassing all his predecessors. During the bloody repressions of 1937 in the USSR alone, more than 600,000 people were executed under Beria's orders. Beria was a reliable executor. He carried out the most bloody and atrocious acts, not to mention the massacring of Poles in 1940 at Katyn. A monstrous act. Execution without trial of more than 22,000 people, prisoners of war and civilians.
Когда он видел, как работает Берия, когда он оценивал его различные действия,
when he saw how Beria worked, he realized that this man would do any of his dirty work for him. For example, to eliminate the head of the Polish army, or to eliminate people for no reason. So thousands of innocent people were killed at Stalin's behest by Comrade Beria, who was extremely afraid of disappointing his leader. June 21st, 1941. Moscow. He was afraid to look into Stalin's eyes. A moment ago, Beria had received the latest intelligence report. The war was imminent, and he had to report this to the leader. But how? Stalin didn't even want to hear about it. He became furious every time he heard of Germany's attacks. Joseph Vissarionovich, the war will begin tomorrow. But we remember your words and feel sure that Hitler won't attack. Stalin looked at him. Beria was petrified. The leader got up and left the cabinet. Beria didn't dare move. He was expecting the worst. I believe that part of Stalin's political power came from his unpredictability. How will this man react? What will his next move be? At any moment, he was ready to use one of his many trump cards, the assassination of certain people. But something incredible happened. After the German invasion, the tyrant Stalin panicked. He stopped responding to calls and went to dacha. For a week, the country was left without leadership. Beria was amazed. He had never seen Stalin like this. He wouldn't tell anyone about their leader's terrible cowardice. Instead, Beria would take leadership of the country. He would create a united authority in the USSR for the period of the war, the State Defense Committee. Beria would visit Stalin and persuade him to hand over the leadership. In this way, he would save the tragic situation on the fronts of World War II. Beria was proud of his ingenuity. His services in the war would be a suitable thank you for Stalin's miraculous rescue. I don't see why people call a man like Beria manager. Above all, he was an executioner and a hangman. As a leader of the state security, he personally tortured, poisoned, and beat people under investigation in his cabinet. Of course, he always blamed Stalin. Beria became confident. The fear that had tormented him for so long had disappeared. Though he had lost connection with his family, though his wife was afraid of him and couldn't understand him, now he felt he had much more than just a family. He had boundless power, dozens of mistresses, and the patronage of the leader. Stalin was indebted to him for his salvation, and he was keen to show his gratitude. 1949, Moscow. The news received from Khrushchev of what happened at Stalin's dacha kept Beria awake at night. During dinner, the leader suddenly got up and called his two old friends to follow him into the bathroom. Stalin turned on the shower, looked around, and whispered,
"Я перестал доверять Лаврентию."
Beria knew exactly what this meant. Stalin wanted him removed. But there was something else. Now, Beria realized that the tables had been turned. Stalin was now afraid of him. It was the final signal. Beria knew he could not wait any longer. After so many years of loyal service, Stalin wanted to get rid of him. But Beria would take brutal revenge for the fear that had followed him around for so many years. He would survive. He would make sure that the man who ruined his life would be dead. Beria, Khrushchev, Malenkov, and Bulganin gathered that evening and planned everything in detail. First, they needed to remove the leader's closest men, his personal secretary, Khrushchev, and his security chief, General Vlasic. Then, at another dinner at the dacha, Stalin must suffer a stroke that would kill him immediately, leaving no chance of survival. Stalin must die in front of witnesses. Also, there must be doctors and children. The plan was agreed, and they began to act. 1953. Stalin's dacha. The day had come. All the conspirators gathered at Stalin's dacha in Kuntsevo. Beria seemed jolly. He was smiling and joking. Years spent in fear made him a wonderful actor. However, inside, another fear was growing. Any of the conspirators could be a traitor, and then it would be his end. At the table, there was a playful atmosphere. Stalin was smiling and puffing his pipe. Beria was watching his every move. He noticed his leader had suddenly become gloomy. The poison was working. Stalin got up from the table. He said goodnight to the guests, complaining of fatigue. Beria went after him. It was I who first claimed that Stalin had been poisoned back in 2001 in my first book. Today, there are stories telling that they analyzed Stalin's medical history. They consulted doctors and found out that there was poison in his blood. Beria was no longer afraid. Now he was the personification of that fear to others. In his order given to Khrushchev, there was an open claim to the empty throne. However, Beria was not destined to get it. "10 a.m., June 28, 1953, Moscow. It was a usual working morning. He was sitting in his cabinet. It had been 2 months since Stalin's death, and Beria had a lot of plans. He was preparing a huge transformation in the country. That morning, he was in a wonderful mood. He was the only member of the CC Presidium who openly expressed his joy of Stalin's death. This, of course, was an indiscretion, because he had to understand that the leaders, his other associates, still idolized Stalin. And, of course, they saw him as an enemy. He felt that his life had just begun. He didn't notice a car approaching the house or the people getting out of it.
Secret documents. I must deliver them personally. Come in.
The doors opened with a bang. Armed servicemen ran into the cabinet. Beria realized that his former allies had betrayed him. He rushed for the gun in his briefcase, but it was too late. People in the street stopped when they heard the gunshot in the mansion. In the cabinet, it was all over. The official history says that Beria had a long trial and only then was shot as a state criminal. In fact, he died 6 months before his documented date of death.
Beria's murder was staged this way. The Presidium of the CC was informed that there was data incriminating Beria of the organization of armed conspiracy. They needed to invite Beria to the Presidium and interrogate him. What if Beria refused to come to the Presidium? Khrushchev ordered to send 2 generals to bring Beria to the Presidium. When the generals returned, they informed them that Beria had resisted and therefore had been killed. They declared that Beria had been arrested and there was an ongoing investigation. But Beria was already dead.
His body was buried in the Lubyanka's courtyard, along with all his personal belongings. All except the desperate fear that was responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of innocent people.